Again, for those of you who don't remember, I'm Carter Snead, the director of the Center for Ethics and Culture. And tonight is our, as we always do, we will conclude the fall conference with the Nicola family lecture. And we would like to remember the Nicola family and their extraordinary generosity, Tony, Christy, Kaylee, Ted, and CJ, wonderful family who has made this evening possible, as well as many other aspects of the work of the Center for Ethics and Culture. It's a great and extraordinary honor for me to introduce our final guest of the conference. Harvey Mansfield is the William R. Keenan Jr. Professor of Government at Harvard University, where he has been a member of the faculty since 1962. Professor Mansfield first came to Harvard in 1949. After receiving his bachelor's degree in 1953, he spent a year in England on a Fulbright fellowship and then served in the United States Army for 2 years in the U.S. and in France. And on this Veterans Day weekend, on behalf of the University of Notre Dame and the Center for Ethics and Culture, we would like to thank Professor Mansfield, as well as all veterans here tonight and elsewhere, for their service to our country. The name Harvey Mansfield is synonymous with the very best in political philosophy. From his first work, Statesmanship and Party Government, published in 1965, he has made the study of parties and partisanship central to his work. He is the leading scholar of the theory of modern executive power, which was the theme of his 1989 work, Taming the Prince, and many articles since. With his late wife, Delba Winthrop, he published a definitive translation of Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. But he is perhaps best known for his scholarship on Nicola Machiavelli, the theme that brings him to the Center for Ethics and Culture tonight. He has published translation of Machiavelli's Prince, Discourses on Livy, and Florentine Histories, as well as 2 book-length studies of Machiavelli and dozens of articles. In 2004, he accepted the National Humanities Medal from President George W. Bush, and in 2007, he delivered the Jefferson Lecture at the National Endowment for the Humanities. This year, he is returning to the subject of his first book as he finishes work on the state of our political parties. Harvey has never stopped teaching in the classroom, in which he is a devoted and beloved teacher. Like almost every year since 1962, he is teaching the history of ancient, medieval, and modern philosophy to students this fall and spring. He has supervised generations of graduate students as well, and has left his mark, his effectual truth, through the education of scholars and statesmen. Educating the Prince was the title of his first Festschrift. He has taught would-be statesmen why they must care for the soul, and would-be philosophers what they must learn from the city. Above all, he has provided a lifelong example of uniting seriousness about politics with a pursuit of the truth, accompanied by his famous gentlemanliness and manliness. Please join me in welcoming an extraordinary man and an extraordinary scholar. Please welcome Harvey Mansfield.
Thank you, Carter. Sometimes the frame of the picture is more beautiful than the picture itself. So I hope I can live up to what you have said of me. The phrase necessary evil is sometimes used loosely, simply to mean a choice between 2 good things. A lecture and a football game, for example. And I'm hoping that Notre Dame has better luck than Harvard did today. In my lifetime, barely in my lifetime, a necessary evil was for Britain and the United States to ally with Stalin to defeat Hitler. That alliance made it necessary to pretend that Stalin was not evil. It's easy to think that your ally is your friend. You have to tolerate his evil. It seems impossible to oppose every evil at once. And necessary evil is the commonest excuse for evil. Alistair MacIntyre, in his talk earlier at this conference, said that evil as opposed to bad is intentional. But evil that is imposed on you is not intentional. You have no choice. But then what do we say of a man who generalizes the necessary evil intentionally and profoundly, morally, politically, and philosophically in his books, to declare emphatically that necessity should replace the good as the standard of human behavior? Not the necessity of evil, but instead he says the necessity of being not good. This man made himself the prince or the captain of an army, a master conspirator who laid the foundation 500 years ago for the politics, ethics, and philosophy that today we call modernity. I have somehow been awarded the parting shot at this conference on good and evil, and now I'm using it to explain the thought of a man who invited the nickname of Old Nick, the devil's advocate par excellence. So what I say about necessity won't exhaust the subject in Machiavelli, but I'll discuss a few familiar passages in the Prince and the Discourses on Livy in order to outline the complexity of that notion. His appeal to necessity is designed overall to simplify not just our politics and morality, but our thinking in general. Necessity will give us access to the truth without having to sort out dialectical disputes or to consult high-minded rationalizations. Our judgments and the policies of princes will have a clearer standard than ever before by which to see the world and act in it through the foggy confusion fostered by religion and philosophy. Yet, in fact, a word not quite invented but prepared by Machiavelli, necessity is not so simple as it first appears. I begin from the last sentence of Machiavelli's clarion call to modern morality and modern politics, taken from the first paragraph in chapter 15 of The Prince, in which he says how and why he departs from the orders of others. And here's the last sentence in that first paragraph. Hence it is necessary for a prince, if he wants to maintain himself, to learn to be able not to be good. See, it's not enough just not to be good, you have to learn. And use this and not use it according to necessity. So he's used necessity. It's necessary to choose according to necessity. In this sentence, he identifies his departure as moving to a new standard of necessity. And he makes it emphatic by using necessary twice and in two different meanings. The first as what one is compelled to do, it is necessary. And the second as the standard for choice, according to necessity. When not compelled by necessity, it appears, one must choose it. This double meaning is the first item of complexity in necessity. That necessity is not always compelling and does not in every case do away with choice. Machiavelli gives a reason for adopting the focus of necessity in the exercise of one's choices. Quote, a man who wants to make a profession of good in all regards must come to ruin among so many who were not good. That's from this same 15th chapter of The Prince. A man, one notes, not only a prince. The scope of this statement is not confined to politics. Indeed, the focus may be beyond politics as well as, or more than politics. for he says that his intent is, quote, to write something useful to whoever understands it. This person could be a political scientist or a philosopher like himself. And he immediately mentions, quote, the many who have imagined republics and principalities that have never been seen or known to exist in truth. These are the ones whose orders he departs from. One thinks of the orders in Plato's Republic, if a king could rule a republic. In St. Augustine's City of God, if God could be a prince. The advice he is about to give applies to philosophers and ordinary citizens, as well as to princes. Machiavelli will divulge a universal standard of behavior, a new one. Quote, a profession of good is what is the standard Machiavelli departs from. It represents a choice made regardless of necessity, even in defiance of necessity, as when one acts and defends one's action by professing that it is good, regardless of the sacrifice of one's own well-being and the risk of coming to ruin. For let us not suppose that the reason Machiavelli gives for following necessity, that it will bring you to ruin if you don't, is brand new and has never occurred before to humans facing difficult choices. Making a sacrifice, taking a risk, is what is known as nobility, though Machiavelli does not mention it here. Plato and Aristotle seem clearly to be Machiavelli's adversaries, particularly Aristotle, who begins his Politics by declaring that political science must speak nobly, quote, in order to be true. Machiavelli, to put it mildly, is no friend of the gentleman, the noble, and the good, on which Aristotle's Politics rests and to whom it is addressed. Also included in the category of those nobly resisting necessity might be Christian martyrs. Though it may well be true that noble examples are rare, they are impressive and are able to set the standard by which the gentleman and ordinary people, too, judge others and themselves. Despite its focus on the noble few, this standard has made itself universal, encompassing all humans by taking advantage of human admiration for the best. Machiavelli departs from this standard and creates a new one to replace it. Now, in the old standard, what is the reason for making a profession of good rather than merely doing good? A noble deed might seem to shine by itself, just as doing a good deed is doing it in order to be good, not for some cause or incentive outside its goodness. In speaking of a profession of good, however, Machiavelli implies that the profession is needed. Goodness does not stand on its own unaided. It needs the support of a profession that makes it possible or reasonable to attempt. If you are good, what is the guarantee that others, particularly the many who are not good, will make it reasonable to be good? Will the wicked not gladly proceed to take advantage of you? You must therefore presuppose a good society, one not in the hands of rascals and rogues, that will make it possible for you to be good without coming to ruin. And the good society must be compatible with human nature, which too must be good. And then the goodness of human nature must be compatible with or comforted by the goodness of non-human nature, the whole. For what can human goodness accomplish on its own, so to speak, without nature's cooperation? Nature must contribute an environment in which good men can thrive, powerful inclinations toward good in the human soul, and a regularity of motions and seasons permitting good men to live in confidence and understanding rather than fear for survival in blind ignorance. So Machiavelli rightly extends the required reason behind doing good to a profession, that is, an explanation of the contextual support, and that profession of the good must be, quote, in all regards. The reassurance that morality needs is a profession of the whole, clearly a philosophical task. If Machiavelli is going to dispute the profession of good that philosophers, especially Plato and Aristotle, the classic ones, have provided, he will have to cover the same ground in order to show that he is right and they are wrong. He will have to make a profession of necessity in all regards, counter to the profession of good in all regards. One may quickly compare Aristotle, the professor of good, with Machiavelli, the professor of necessity. Whereas Aristotle starts his Nicomachean ethics from the existence and practice of moral people, implying that morality exists, is viable, and a going concern that one merely has to examine rather than create, Machiavelli begins this critical passage with a critique of morality, denying that it is viable and asserting that it will bring you to ruin. To ruin. Rather than begin from the assumption that moral people exist, he tells you that you will suffer for being, quote, among so many who are not good. Machiavelli did not live in a secular age like ours, in which it is assumed that ruin in this world will not be redeemed in the next world. In his circumstance, and with his ever-present awareness, his statement of sure ruin implies a flat denial of redemption, rather than mere disregard of that possibility. Together with Christianity, he disagrees with Aristotle that morality exists and adopts the Christian view of the sinfulness of the world. But he seems to foreclose the redemption in the next world promised by Christianity. The Redeemer he promises in The Prince is a worldly one for Italy in the last chapter 26 of The Prince. In The Prince and the Discourses on Livy, Machiavelli speaks of, quote, the world, rather than of, quote, this world, which implies another world beyond this one. Necessity, then, has the character of a presumption. Machiavelli, in making his departure, fears he may be held presumptuous. And in fact, he has a presumption, the presumption of necessity, as opposed to the rival presumption of the good. As a presumption, necessity is not a determination that in each case, one who chooses the good will inevitably come to ruin. With luck, a good man might be safe from the many who are not good, and prosperous to boot. But one cannot count on such luck. For the good man, it is in a strong sense fitting, conviene, that he come to ruin for holding the wrong presumption. He deserves it. Machiavelli does not expel fortune, but he also does not suffer it. Prudence for him is not to take account of risk when necessary, but rather to do so in principle, always avoiding evil by presuming that it will be encountered. Thus, this passage anticipates his nearly explicit statement that one must do evil to the other fellow before he does it to you. You may not succeed, to be sure, but the contingency of things may go against you, because the contingency may go against you. Perhaps the good person will not be punished for his goodness, but with the correct presumption, you have a better chance. The presumption of necessity is supported by the impending presence of ruin, as the profession of good is not. Who wants to come to ruin? When confronting the stark face of necessity, almost everyone is easily persuaded, or since persuasion may not be necessary, easily moved towards safety, regardless of imaginary or imaginative persuasions to do otherwise. If necessity is not apparent, it can be made so, and often with actions better than words. Its being apparent, or easy to make apparent, is part of the simplicity that gives it power and makes its truth, quote, effectual. Necessity has the spontaneity of animal nature behind it, whereas the good needs to be thought about and deliberated. So the presumption of necessity is less presumptuous than the presumption of good. One could ask what the presumption of good would provide if it were not for necessity enlisted on the side of the good. One could also ask what the presumption of necessity would do without the presumption that necessity brings good. Machiavelli takes pains to show that those who presume on the power of good actually try to endow the good with necessity when they promise preservation with the profession of good. The higher presumption of good, he points out, depends on the lower presumption of necessity. The higher good depends on the lower good. It might seem that Machiavelli does not have to deny the higher good, the good life, beyond the necessity of preserving one's life. He merely shows that the good life depends on being alive. But this means that the good life, or a life devoted to nobility, is not possible among so many who are not good. For to stay alive, one must learn how not to be good and use this knowledge according to necessity. Nobility is a delusion that depends on a life beyond life that does not exist. It is an imaginary form of self-preservation. Machiavelli will teach those who desire nobility how truly to attain it and assure it. Here, speaking so emphatically of necessity, Machiavelli takes a long step in the direction of scientific determinism. But he does not go the whole way. By retaining the need for good fortune, he holds to human freedom and virtue in the management of fortune. Machiavellian prudence will be rewarded, typically, but not necessarily, in every case. What will not be rewarded is the prudence that serves only the good and that cooperates with nobility and welcomes the help of prayer. This is the prudence of Aristotle, which he distinguishes from cunning in the service of evil. But for Machiavelli, prudence seems to be the same as shrewdness, astutia, not distinct from it as with Aristotle. Reason in practice, and so also in theory, is not on the side of goodness. Machiavelli shows his awareness of the need to go beyond morality in order to question it by speaking of a new sort of truth that will settle the dispute over morality, the effectual truth, verita effectuale. That phrase he uses just once in all of his writings, including his letters, all of his writings and his legations, just once in this first paragraph in the 15th chapter of The Prince. It's also a phrase, verita effettuale, which occurs only this once in the whole Italian Renaissance. And since I'm speaking to a learned audience, I would be grateful if anyone could give me a source for this phrase, effectual truth. Not effective, but effectual. The Italian scholars of various editions of The Prince pass over this phrase, though it is amazing that it should have occurred only this once. They pass over it because it has no source. That makes it more interesting, not less. The effectual truth is opposed to the imagined truth stated in professions of goodness, and it is shown in effects. For example, Machiavelli shows near the beginning of the Discourses on Livy that the disputes between the nobles and the plebs in the Roman Republic should not be condemned, as did writers under the influence of classical political science, including Livy, had done. This criticism was based on an imagined possible harmony between the two typical parties in every republic. But Machiavelli contends that in their effects, the disputes were the cause of Rome's becoming strong and free. the effects were the outcome in practice, as we would now say, in effect or in fact, of conflicting opinions that might be resolved on the level of imagined theory, but in the world as it is would be resolved only as they made men act. In this case, the superiority or nobility of the nobles was not deferred to by the plebs, but understood as oppressive and opposed, and the result was a contentious republic that had the power to expand and the prudence to satisfy, or at least to appease, the people. In The Prince, Machiavelli's discussion of morality, after announcing the idea of effectual truth, explains that the various virtues, called qualities in chapter 15, take effect in the ways in which they are held, tenuto, held to be, not as they are. For example, liberality may be presumed to be the prudent action of a noble prince, benefiting its people, his people. But it ends up, in effect, as illustrating the maxim that a prince should be measly with his gifts and make them with other people's money, not his own. Liberality is what it will be held to be, its effectual truth, not what it is imagined to be. This sort of truth will later be known as empirical because it is based on fact. To the ancients, a fact was a that, hoti, to which one could point. But that comes and goes and is not truth, which is permanent. Facta, erga in Greek, were deeds as opposed to speeches, not truth as opposed to imagination, as for Machiavelli. Machiavelli's profession of necessity develops a context in which necessity will be understood and appreciated rather than ignored, set aside, or suppressed, as happens with professions of good. This context is the world, which he constantly invokes, together with the worldly things, cose del mondo, which he says he's studied and had experience of which it is composed. The world, as we've seen, rejects the invisible next world of Christian belief and theology, together with the intelligible world of classical rationalism. The world is visible, and it can be known regardless of any invisible world of Platonic ideas hovering above it, or Aristotle's essences making it intelligible. The world consists of simple and mixed bodies, the simple bodies of nature and the mixed bodies of nature and human forming. There are no natural forms to be seen, only forms of human conception to be, quote, introduced. The prudence of a prince can put his form on the material of his principality in the political deed that Machiavelli offers to describe human knowing. A prince knows what he is doing when he is introducing his form, which is making his presence, that is, his truth, effectual. Knowledge of the world is not distinct from acting upon it, for the world's necessities, when understood, open the way for the prince's intervention into it. The neutrality of worldly things, which are permanent though not intelligible, permits and promotes the enterprises of princes and captains. The world is a whole on its own, as the world of sense. It is not a whole with parts, as it is composed of unintelligible things that behave according to necessity. Necessity is divided into necessities, especially in regard to humans, where each human being has his own necessity, for which he must exercise his own arms. We are all set against one another in a manner later to be formulated by Thomas Hobbes's State of Nature. But there are also groupings of men very relevant to politics, particularly the division of humor, he uses the word humor, between those who desire to command other men and those who desire not to be commanded. A humor is a medical term that refers to exhalations arising from the body, not the soul, hence indicating a typical necessity rather than a typical choice. Such are necessities apparent in behavior to be compared with rulers and ruled in Aristotle's political science, in which those qualities can be found within the soul and begin from it. One sees it for Machiavelli, rule is necessarily repressive and hence necessarily obnoxious to the ruled. The two necessities are contrary, and given the necessity of rule or of commanding, they cannot be made harmonious in a whole, a regime, in which a common purpose or way of life can be fostered and pursued. Conflict between the two parties of nobles and plebs in the Roman Republic made it free as well as strong. It was indeed, quote, the first cause of keeping it free. Freedom can be found in both the princely and the popular humor, as the freedom to command for princes, ultimately to be alone, to be essere solo, to be alone at the top, and as the freedom to oppose or resist being commanded for the people. Each humor, each aspect of freedom is felt as a necessity that determines behavior rather than a moral choice that guides it. Thus, a free way of life, vivere libero, he says, is one of disunion. The Roman Republic, according to Machiavelli, had an accidental rather than a planned or founded perfection that was gained through the experience and adjustment of conflict, not from the brain of a founder. Or perhaps Machiavelli's brainy redescription of Livy's history constitutes a founding of freedom presented as the two fundamental operational necessities working against each other to produce an unintended common good. Quote, the cause of disunion in republics is usually idleness and peace. The cause of union is fear and war. Human freedom is presented as against other humans and opposed to fortune, nature, or the divine. Human assertiveness and making reasonable claims is presented as irrational human obstinacy. The nobility of freedom is reduced to its raw materials, deprived of its aspiration, and robbed of its tragedy. What is necessary for the princely humor is anathema to the popular one. But as always for Machiavelli, there is a, quote, remedy. It is possible for prudent princes to make the people believe that their being commanded by princes is actually obeying themselves. Government by others can be made to appear as government by oneself, hence free, when it is represented as indirect government that merely executes the will of others and does not impose its own will. The model for indirect government is the church, which claims merely to execute God's will and asks for nothing more than willing obedience to God. Thus, the contrary necessities of princes and peoples can be overcome by prudent use of fraud, for fraud is a necessary feature of all government. With fraud, a regime can seem to be a harmonious whole despite its necessary conflicts. With religious fraud, the whole of things can be induced to make sense to all, to those who know as well as to those who believe. This is the effectual truth of the whole according to the classical and Christian traditions. For in the classical tradition, the familiar visible world holds problems that need clarification in thought. And in the Christian dispensation, the earthly world is racked with sin. Both try to make greater sense of the visible through the invisible. This general attempt Machiavelli rejects. When he speaks of hidden causes, it is of forces within the world as appreciated by, quote, knowers of the world. Yet Machiavelli does not dispense with the word or even the notion of sin. On the contrary, he appropriates it from Christianity and uses it to his purpose. In The Prince, sin is used twice in an allusion to Savonarola, who was unnamed but said to be speaking the truth when he said that our sins were the cause of Italy's being invaded by a foreign power. Machiavelli corrects him, declaring that the sins were not the ones he described, but, quote, the ones I have told of. And these were the sins of princes. Having thus assumed responsibility from a heretic for redeeming the sins of Italy, he then, in the discourses, uses sin 13 times in order to supply his understanding of the word to replace the authoritative Christian one. First, he generalizes the rebellious preaching of Savonarola as a deed of citizens who, quote, sin against the free state, then excuses princes who are prompted to sin out of ingratitude, as done out of necessity, then denounces the sin of not punishing ambitious captains and identifies such sins as errors. If people sin, it is only because they've been made to do so by princes. In sum, it is the people who believe in sin as an offense to God, an invisible explanation of a visible deed. This is their necessity, which princes must understand and respect. To do so, to punish or correct as errors the sins that regard the state, one will need the help of a prudent individual. Uno prudente. This would be Machiavelli himself, speaking in the last chapter of the Discourses. He understands that necessity cannot do away with the moral explanation as sin that moral people necessarily hold to. Necessity for Machiavelli is expressed in the world of sense. Perhaps it is not necessarily expressed there, but Machiavelli inflates necessity beyond its normal confines. In that world, ruin for the body is graver than perfection or salvation for the soul, which does not exist in it. Knowing that the world requires learning how not to be good among the many who are not good. This means adopting the goal and practices of acquiring. Quote, and truly it is very natural, an ordinary thing to desire to acquire. Moral condemnation of it is effectual only when one attempts to acquire and fails. One might believe, and Machiavelli at first says, that an hereditary prince, who hardly disturbs the people he rules, is a natural prince because he has, quote, less cause and less necessity to offend. But in view of the natural and ordinary necessity to acquire, Machiavelli corrects his view of the natural prince. It is not the hereditary prince, but the new prince. On his arrival in power, the new prince cannot help offending both his enemies whom he has displaced and his friends whom he may disappoint. The necessity to acquire applies to the hereditary prince as well, because he must take care to stay ahead of those who desire to acquire will operate against him. He must anticipate them and do to them first what they plan to do to him. Maintaining his state will necessarily require the same means as used by others to displace him. And anticipation becomes the rule of those who hold an acquisition as much as those who seek to gain one. The fear of losing generates the same ambition as the desire to acquire, but to greater effect, since the holder of the state has greater means. How new must the new prince be? How far does the necessity to acquire extend? It seems at first that the new prince must depend on his opportunity to acquire. For example, that Moses found the people of Israel oppressed by the Egyptians. But on further reflection, we are told that a prince can build his own foundations so as to make his own opportunity. Those foundations might consist of the customs and opinions of his time as enshrined in religion, particularly the Christianity Machiavelli found in his own time, which thought so little of the honor of the world that he thought necessary to defend. A prince then would have to change the thinking of his people, creating for them a new sect and becoming himself the prophet of that sect. The best way to do this might not be to create a new sect, but to take the existing sect and transform it to one's own purpose. This is what Machiavelli did to Christianity, as he shows by citing the example of David and Goliath in chapter 13 of The Prince. There he says that David insisted on using his own arms against Goliath, his sling and his knife. But of course, the Bible says that David went into battle armed only with the sling. The knife he picked up from Goliath and used it to cut off his head. One's own arms, for Machiavelli makes that phrase into a motto, include the arm of your enemy used against him. He becomes a sort of prince himself whose new foundations reject and replace the reliance of man on God, as stated in the Bible by David before engaging Goliath, with man's own freedom and independence. This is how far necessity extends, the necessity to replace enslavement by freedom, and to do so by all means necessary. The necessity to acquire compels one to use force and fraud, especially fraud. Those who, quote, rise from small beginnings to sublime ranks, and Machiavelli cites his exemplar, the Romans, always find it necessary to use fraud, and are, quote, the less worthy of reproach, the more it is covert. Obviously, they cannot use open force at first when they are weak, but they could excuse themselves from blame for using fraud by remembering that the power they displace also rose to height by the same means, and as with the necessity to acquire in order to maintain, so with the necessity for fraud. A powerful prince needs to use fraud to protect himself against the fraud that will be used against him. Thus, because acquiring means acquiring from others or in competition with others, secrecy becomes essential to princes. When anticipation is the rule, one cannot afford to let others, that is, one's enemies, know what is being planned against them. The characteristic mode of behavior becomes conspiracy, not only in politics, but in all society influenced by politics, including friendship. Morality, by its effects, is politicized, and the refuge from the rigors of politics of a private life is denied, particularly in the case of, quote, men who have quality and who might prefer to live quietly and without quarrel, a formulation reminding of the Epicurean motto of live unnoticed. Such men will have to be ambitious despite their preference and may have to resort to playing crazy. One must, said fare pazzo. One must make oneself mad and praise, speak, see, and do things against your intent in order to please the prince. It is a very wise thing to live a life of conspiracy, and a necessity that must be judged particularly by the few who might prefer the contemplative life. In both The Prince and the Discourses on Livy, Machiavelli's master writings, because they are the only ones he describes at the beginning as containing everything he knows, the longest chapter is on conspiracy. Conspiracy is pervasive and comprehensive in politics. It can be used by a ruling prince as well as against him, by a republic as well as against it. Machiavelli not only justifies conspiracy, as did other writers, but also shows how to execute one, explaining how to act in the 3 stages of before, during, and after the event. To execute a conspiracy is to execute the object of it, 2 related meanings of esecuzione. Of course, the secret of a conspiracy comes out in its completion, but the effect of such a deed is much greater for its having been kept secret beforehand. The suddenness of execution, ad uno tratto, with 1 stroke, adds to the attention it receives. For example, the spectacle of Cesare Borgia's murder of his henchman Ramiro de Orco. Its ferocity left the people satisfied and stupefied, their hatred for Ramiro purged from their spirits. As opposed to tragedy, which purges the spirits of an audience so as to teach them a lesson, Machiavelli's purging is merely cathartic and to the advantage of the prince. That religion is a kind of purging is shown by Machiavelli's worldly reduction of it. For him, morality and religion are effectively the same, because morality cannot prove that humans are able to afford to be moral without recourse to divinity in the next world. The God must be there to punish and reward. And to do so, he makes commands on humans who as such are imperfect sinners. Yet most humans, the people, are imperfect sinners because they are too weak to sin without fearing the consequences. So they must have religion, but they cannot live by it. The necessity of living by religion is counteracted by the necessary impossibility of doing so. Men being sinners, they cannot live without sinning. So they need a church and a priesthood that both enforces the commands of religion and provides the relief of forgiveness from those commands. Necessity must be applied by sacrifices and must necessarily be relaxed and purged by atonements. In Machiavelli's play Mandragola, the priest, Brother Timothy, plays a crucial role in the seduction of the beautiful and moral Lucrezia by offering relief from God's sanctions. He cites God's approval in the Bible of incest for Lot and his daughters as a present-day license for adultery done to produce an heir. God's necessity to repopulate the world justifies the comically corresponding human necessity to reproduce. Though the deed must be kept secret, Machiavelli's play is the unfolding of a conspiracy made possible by the conspiracy with necessity, human necessity that is religion. For Machiavelli, religion is not the overcoming of the world's necessities that it claims to be. In its promises as well as its demands, it accords with the necessity arising from human weakness. It is not concerned with goodness, or not so much as it is concerned with predicting and controlling the future, hence providing security for human weakness. More than finding remedies for their faults, humans want to know what is in store for them as they are. They prefer security to reform. Religion is essentially an attempt to master fortune, but the present religion, as he describes Christianity, does this in the interests of priests who do not believe in it. His own replacement or reformation of Christianity, putting it under the mastery of the princes of the world, does no more disrespect to Christianity than Christianity has done to itself. Christianity, he says, quotes, chose the truth and the true way, a careful statement that falls definitively short of saying that it is true. Christianity will indeed show the truth and the true way as Machiavelli appropriates it to his own use in accordance with its effectual truth as modes and orders of human government, with which, as we've seen, he will redeem the sinfulness of the world. His own atheism will take advantage of the atheism of Christian priests who, quote, do not fear the punishment that they do not see and do not believe. But it will not be able to abolish religion and will not try. Religion and pre-Machiavellian morality will continue in the world as the necessary dissatisfaction with its uncertainties and the unpredictability of fortune. Machiavelli surely encourages cynicism about morality, but he knows that he cannot convince most people to abandon morality. Goodness is not enough. La bontà non basta, he says. But it will not disappear. Hence, Machiavelli does not attempt to construct a universal new morality, as did later thinkers on the basis of a universal right of self-preservation. According to him, virtue for the princes will always have to contend with goodness for peoples. The prospect that he might be known as Old Nick and his advice become notorious as Machiavellian would neither have deterred nor surprised him. A special instance of this is a Machiavellian speech of an unnamed leader of the plebeian Ciompi rebellion in Florence, which, because of its repeated reliance on necessity, deserves and bears close examination. This is in the Florentine Histories, in Book 3, Chapter 13. An orator there speaks, it is said, quote, to inspire the others, but he says that he teaches what necessity requires. Apparently, necessity sometimes needs to be inspired in those to whom it applies. Necessity does not necessarily make itself effectual, but has to be taught in a striking way. He begins by saying that if he had to deliberate whether to take up arms, burn and rob homes, and despoil churches, he would agree, quote, to put quiet poverty ahead of perilous gain. No moral qualms in these deeds would occur to him. But speaking now in the midst of rebellion, he says that we have no choice but to multiply the evils already committed and add more companions in them so that more will suffer, because universal injuries are borne more patiently than particular ones. Thus can we gain pardon more easily, as well as, quote, live with more freedom and more satisfaction than we have in the past. Here a gallon of whitewash is needed to save Machiavelli as the champion of Republican freedom and virtue. The orator goes on to disparage the nobles who oppose the plebs. Don't be dismayed by their antiquity of blood, he declares. Strip all of us naked, and you will see that we are all alike. Forget conscience and possible infamy, for whereas with us there is, quote, fear of hunger in prison, there cannot and should not be fear of hell. And then he generalizes grandly, for faithful servants are always servants, and good men are always poor. God and nature have put us where we are, in the midst of exposure to wickedness. So, quote, one should use force whenever the occasion for it is given to us. This is a course of action, I confess, says the orator, that is bold and dangerous. But when necessity presses, boldness is judged prudence. Quote, spirited men never take account of the danger in great things, for those enterprises that are begun with danger always end with reward. The original claim that this circumstance is special, the initial concession that one should hesitate over perilous gain, are entirely withdrawn in this sort of caricature, Machiavellian speech that is a self-drawn caricature of Machiavelli himself. To be in the midst of a plebeian rebellion is not exceptional, but reveals the essential condition of man. All of us stripped naked, exposed to danger and wickedness. Here, again, is Thomas Hobbes' state of nature, not just an embryo, but alive and kicking. The nature of man's situation is taken from the extreme case and made universal to cover all normal cases. In fact, the concept of normal as opposed to abnormal is reversed, so that the abnormal, formerly the exception, becomes the rule. Here, too, the future course of modern science is previewed. The nature of man is taken from nature stripped of convention, as it were in a laboratory experiment, when nature is tortured and everything normally hidden emerges. in the practice of experiment, scientific fact is disclosed, as opposed to ordinary observations made complacently without the benefit of the pressure of necessity. We should also notice the ambition of the orator for great things and his willingness to face great danger and enterprises with the expectation of reward. The plebeian orator, who inspires the mob by appealing to necessity, shows again the unexpected complexity of Machiavelli's profession of that notion. Humans must not only choose necessity, but also be inspired to choose it. That politics is ruled by necessity does not at all mean that political things must be accepted as they are with resignation, leading to disdain for the political life and the search for, quote, quiet poverty in contemplation, perhaps, that the orator momentarily considered attractive. Instead, Machiavelli seeks to inspire his readers with a spiritedness, an animo, that will lead them to virtue, virtu, in the sort of active acquisition that he defines as the political life. Animo easily recalls the thumos, by which the classical political scientists referred to the spirited part of the soul. Machiavelli does not mention the soul in The Prince and the Discourses on Livy, his two chief works, and he seems to treat animo as his replacement for soul, substituting animo for anima. The necessity for animo is further complicated by the complacency of routine that all the achievements of virtue induce. Machiavelli presents this universal consequence of virtue in a well-known passage in his Florentine histories. There seems to be a cycle in history in which virtue gives birth to quiet, quiet to leisure, leisure to disorder, disorder to ruin, and then from ruin a rise in reverse through the stages. The danger of leisure is paramount, and especially the use of leisure for philosophy, illustrated in the protest by Cato against the corrupting presence of philosophy in Rome. Applying this dilemma between what is good for a republic and what is good for philosophy to his time, and to the difference between the virtue and greatness of the ancients and the weakness of the moderns, Machiavelli closes with a suggestion. Perhaps, he says, it may be no less useful to know the modern weakness than the ancient strength, because if the latter excites the liberal spirits to follow, the former will excite such spirits to avoid and eliminate it. This is a statement of Machiavelli's liberal spirit, and apparently he has a remedy for avoiding the cyclical necessity of virtue and disorder. The general program for a lasting or even permanent revival out of weakness is supplied in the Discourses on Livy. There he concludes that, quote, nothing is more necessary in any common way of life than to give back to it the reputation it had in its beginnings. Necessity leads out of necessity when prudently understood as requiring a return to the beginnings and to the original fear that underlies the complacency of civilization. This return has to be a political act, a sensational change of regime that catches attention, as opposed to the steady accumulation of property that later Machiavellians, agreeing with Machiavelli as to the necessity to acquire, substituted for the riskiness of Machiavellian virtue. As virtue is risky, the goal of virtue is glory, which one might say is a semblance of nobility. In the sense of glory, nobility is not opposed to necessity, but rather gained through necessity, an insight for which Machiavelli praises certain moral philosophers he does not name. Fraud, for example, might seem to be necessary, though detestable. But no, fraud in managing war is glorious. Machiavelli's use of fraud, one might propose, is the highest degree of his glory. So understood, Machiavelli can return his profession of necessity to the profession of good, the latter having been duly limited and disciplined. the new prince must arm his subjects. Not all of them, because that is not possible, but some of them. Which should he choose? On thinking it through, he will see that it is easier to gain to himself those who had been content with the previous state, his former enemies, rather than with his former friends, who had their own reason for becoming so and would be more demanding of him. In Machiavelli's own case, he would, one supposes, be thinking of Christian priests as his new friends. Such a course may not be perfect, but one can never seek to avoid one inconvenience without running into another. And prudence consists in picking the less bad inconvenience as good. The next chapter of The Prince on the secretaries to the prince discusses only one case, that of a minister who is more excellent than the prince he advises. One knows of necessity, Machiavelli says, that this prince was either in the first rank of inventiveness or the second, being able to recognize good deeds, though incapable of conceiving them. This minister cannot hope to deceive him and remains good himself. So, at least in the case of a minister advising a prince, it is necessary for the minister to appear good and faithful. Machiavelli, as advisor to princes, is of necessity faithless to any particular one of them, because his advice is general or universal and can be used by the enemies of any prince whom he advises. But Machiavelli is himself also under the necessity of proving to be good for the princes he advises, and not merely offering irresponsible advice in order to make himself look good. We see that necessity is judged, in the end, by how much good it leads to, even if the good in this case is only apparent. Machiavelli, the professor of necessity, is obliged to profess the necessity of the good. The effectual truth is not the only truth. He must admit the primacy of the good over necessity. Thank you.
Friends, we have time for some questions. Please come to the microphones, as you have throughout the conference, to ask questions of Professor Mansfield.
Good evening. Thank you for your talk, Dr. Mansfield. My name is Isaac Kimmel. I'm a first-year sociology graduate student here at Notre Dame. I was noticing, and I mean, you said Machiavelli is the father of modernity, so this is in no way surprising, but I was seeing his intellectual DNA in a lot of different thinkers over the course of the last hour and change.
I'm sorry, I'm not following in. Could you?
Yeah, sure.
Speak more slowly into the mic.
My apologies.
Yeah, that's okay.
I was seeing a lot of Machiavelli's intellectual DNA in various modern thinkers throughout your talk.
Yes.
But for this question, I'd like to just highlight Marx and Nietzsche in particular. I was,
Right.
just keep it narrow.
Anyone else? You want to add?
I mean, William James and Descartes came to mind too, but we'll keep it to just those two, keep it modest. But you were talking about the need of the prince to be ruthless and self-serving, and that reminded me of Nietzsche, and I don't know that Machiavelli is quite as broad in his sort of ethics, right? Nietzsche talks about serving life and the will, and he sort of justifies the ruthlessness that he advocates. I don't know if Machiavelli is that profound in his ethics, right? He might be a little more shallow, and I might be missing some things, so I would like you to add some more depth to that. And then you also said that Machiavelli argues that rule is necessarily odious to the ruled, and so I was immediately thinking of Marx and how he talks about the rivalry between the bourgeois and the proletariat, and how, and then I was thinking of Nietzsche again when the ruler is trying to keep everyone down by whatever means necessary, and there was just there were a lot of thoughts here, but I see Nietzsche and Marx very strongly, and I was hoping that you could help me flesh those connections out. So I know this is broad, but...
Yeah.
Pick one.
Let's take Nietzsche. No, I'm very reluctant to say that any philosopher is more profound than Machiavelli. That is not an uncontroversial statement, but
Right, well, that's why I'm asking. So
I'll make it anyway. I would advise you against believing it, at any rate, without investigation. Yeah. Nietzsche gives a justification for being ruthless. Because man is characterized by a will to power, and this is a kind of new development of necessity. And I think that Machiavelli has a better sense of the strength of morality than Nietzsche does. And that's why he uses necessity, because necessity is an excuse for immorality. The will to power needs to be expressed in the will to use one's power, for some purpose. So, and I think Machiavelli has a better recognition of this, that the will to power is a kind of incendiary invitation to the young and to others to do total recklessness. Machiavelli is more humane. He wants to improve the condition of morality, of humanity, not the condition of morality, but the condition of humanity. And I think he would see very perilous consequences or effects coming from a philosophy of will to power.
Next question, please.
Hello, Professor Mansfield. Thank you very much for the lecture. I enjoyed it very much. I studied philosophy and history at Columbia University as an undergrad. I have two questions, but I guess I'll just ask the better one. A lot of modern totalitarian rulers have tried very hard to employ this kind of shrewdness in the way they govern their polities, employment of fraud, propaganda, etc. But still, in the end, we don't see that working out quite well. The state falls apart in one way or the other, most cases so far, and the people are by no means sort of obedient to such a rule. How would I don't know, how would Machiavelli account for this? That you have these people really trying to live up to these principles, but not really achieving the kind of, I guess, stable, obedient rule that they're aiming for. And I'm not sure if it has something to do with the last part.
What is it that you're complaining of?
I'm complaining of well, just that imagine I'm a totalitarian dictator. I play by the rule book of Machiavelli, but still you have all these. You have people like Solzhenitsyn proclaiming all sorts of discontent. The citizenship lives under this sort of ideological indoctrination, but still the fraud doesn't quite seep in and make them obedient. I don't know if that's a legitimate complaint or not.
It's hard for me to understand you, but or really to hear you. But Solzhenitsyn spoke of the possibility of nobility, of doing a noble deed, even in the concentration camp, where where existence is fearful, and there's nothing to eat, and little to hope for. But one can still show one's generosity, say, by giving even a little piece of a cigarette butt to another prisoner. And so, and this sort of keeps one's free spirit alive, and one's sense of nobility. That, see, morality is for most people a normal thing, but the test of morality is whether you'll do it in the face of risk or necessity. And so Machiavelli sort of recognizes that, and so he doesn't want to do away with nobility. That's what distinguishes him from most of the Machiavellians who follow, because they want to regularize Machiavelli. They want a virtue that applies to everyone universally. So they're not satisfied with a solution like his, which maintains this division between some who understand things and others who don't, and need to be lied to. So they invent a new morality, a morality of self-interest or of the right of self-preservation, which doesn't require fraud, but still has the same necessity behind it that Machiavelli wanted to retain. And but the trouble is, to do this, they abandon nobility. And this leads to terrific problems later on, as Rousseau and Kant become dissatisfied with the ignoble way of life, which David Hume made a distinction between the eminent virtues and the social virtues. And he said the eminent virtues, that was the ancients, and the social virtues, the moderns. So Machiavelli sort of begins this social virtues, that is a virtue which understands religion in such a way that it doesn't require all that much from you, and then gives free license to the ambition of rulers or princes, people who want to be ruled. So he still has this complexity of distinguishing between types, different typical types of humans. So, but the reduction or the universalization which arises from Machiavelli is unable to do justice to our desire to be better, to admire, and even our simple raw desire for excess, for whatever is more than necessary. So Machiavelli, while opposing that on the whole, understood it better than we do. So it's a good way to sort of see the difference between the moderns and the ancients, to become more knowing in Machiavelli.
Richard.
Thank you. I have, I think, a simpler question, because I'm not sure of the historical timeline. I was wondering, to what extent did Machiavelli work out these ideas from his observation of the world around him and his own reasoning about what would work in that corrupt world, and then persuaded the rulers of Florence to act accordingly? And to what extent was that all already going on from those rulers, and he was providing a kind of after-the-fact gloss or justification for what was already beginning to be done?
Well, that's good, because his understanding of reason is as rationalization. So if you're thinking about whether to do something and you're not sure whether it's to your advantage or not, do it. And once you do it, the reason will come to you. So you're sort of applying a Machiavellian analysis to Machiavelli himself. But actually, he was not satisfied with the qualities of the Renaissance princes that so impress us as distasteful and roguish. So, but there's a chapter in this Discourses on Livy in which he laments the inability of bad men to be altogether bad. They suffer from unexplainable assaults of conscience. Machiavelli once describes conscience as confusione di cervello, confusion of the brain.
We'll take one last question. Yes.
Luke Foster, Social Thought, University of Chicago. So you mentioned that the presumption in chapter 15 involves a picture of the whole implicitly, whether we presume that the universe tends ultimately towards good or towards necessity. That's a metaphysical picture. Why then is Machiavelli so coy about his metaphysics, as compared to, say, someone like Hobbes, who prefaces his whole discussion of the state with a metaphysical argument? Machiavelli's not willing to do that, and why?
So coy, did you say?
Yes.
About?
Metaphysics.
His metaphysics. Yes, if I say he has a metaphysics, he's certainly coy about it. That's true. That's because he has it in for philosophy as a whole. And so that statement that he makes in the Florentine History about philosophy being, and his agreement with Cato, philosophy is it means dissatisfaction with the world as it is. So asking questions about it. And I mean, that's what makes him a philosopher. But he so wants to change philosophy in the direction of effectuality that he covers over his own philosophy necessary to do that. So you have to dig it out. He would rather you be dismissive of philosophy than inquisitive into his own.
Friends, join me once again in thanking our amazing speakers. Thank you very much. This concludes our 18th annual fall conference at the Center for Ethics and Culture. I'd like to renew my thanks for all the amazing people that made this possible. The convention center staff, the staff of all the different offices at Notre Dame that assisted with us are amazing, as I said, world-class, #1 in the world, maybe even the universe staff, including Ken Hellenius, our communications specialist. Yeah, let's do it. Pete Lobsey, our student program manager. Petra Farrell, who runs our Culture of Life programming. Tracy Westlake, who's our administrative assistant. The indefatigable Laura Nash Gonziorek. I skipped her married name when I announced her last time. Our associate director. And finally, the person on our staff who is most responsible for all the amazing experiences that we've had throughout the days, Margaret Cabanis, our academic programming and publications manager. As well as all the wonderful Notre Dame student workers that helped us out. Please join us next year, November 1 through 3, for the 19th annual Fall Conference of the Notre Dame Center for Ethics and Culture. Enjoy yourselves. We have a reception. Continue the conversation, friends. Thank you very much.